Just a couple reminders about what pop-ups are. Many of you attend our events in the evening and sometimes at lunch. Those are usually 75 minutes. They're planned long in advance. Our pop-ups are the only hybrid events that we do. They're an hour. There will be plenty of time still for everyone to ask questions as our guests come and go. And the reason that we call them pop-ups is because we do pop them up off a news subject. So it's a little bit different format. Some of you have been to them before, but just wanted to set that straight away. Today, we have a bevy of distinguished participants to talk about this situation on college campuses and immigration, deportation, and so forth. We have Representative James McGovern, Democrat of Massachusetts, Miriam Jordan, a correspondent for the New York Times who covers both lawful and unlawful immigration, Brian Hauss, the senior staff attorney with the ACLU, and two current IOP fellows, Natalia Pelevina, a political activist from Russia, and Ken Cuccinelli on Zoom, who served in senior roles in the first Trump administration at both INS and the Department of Homeland Security. I think it's important to note for the purpose of this conversation that we did invite administrators from the university to attend, and they declined to attend. But we do feel lucky. We believe we have all points of view or most points of view on this immigration matter represented here on this Zoom today and in the room. And I wanted to again note that I may break in now and then because Representative McGovern is only with us for half of this, so I will allow students to ask him a few questions before he leaves. Then we'll continue the conversation and leave plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So with that being said, Miriam, let's start with you. You have reported that at least 300 international students have been stripped of their ability to stay in the United States. We know students across the nation, including on this campus, have lost their status, been detained, or as we understand it from other reporting as well, deported or have self-deported in anticipation of those actions. You wrote that this has, quote, sown fear among students and confusion at schools. Can you kind of set us in the moment and tell us what's going on? We can't hear him, Miriam?
No. Miriam, could you unmute for us? Sorry about that.
Oops.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
sorry. Hi there, everybody. Thanks for having me. So the weekend before last, I started receiving a stream of messages from lawyers across the country telling me that they had been contacted by college students whose statuses had been terminated. International students, of course. The students didn't know what had caused this, but as the lawyers asked them questions and conferred with each other, a picture emerged. And the picture that emerged was that what they had in common was that by and large, they were not political activists, but they had committed minor infractions in the past that had put them in contact with law enforcement, like speeding, disorderly conduct. And by Monday, it was clear that hundreds, if not more, students had been terminated. There were undergrads, grad students, students who have completed their studies and have been eligible to stay in the United States and work under a particular program that allows for that. Some of the impacted students had boarded planes and left the country immediately because they were so worried that they might be, arrested by immigration enforcement and end up detained. Their families were so worried. And since then, actually, I think the New York Times has tracked about 1,000 students whose statuses have been terminated.
Okay, Ken, you were a key architect and enforcer of President Trump's border and immigration policies in his first term. So recognizing that you are not currently in administration, can you try to explain to us in that context what you see going on here? Is there anything surprising about this? How does this fit into your understanding of the Trump administration's policies?
So, like a lot of other areas in immigration enforcement in this second Trump term, this is very different from the first Trump term. There was internal discussion about student visas and reining them in, but nothing was really ever done with that in the first term. That is very different. Here in the second term, the president campaigned on particularly dealing with folks involved in, for instance, Hamas protesting. And Hamas, that's sort of a unique animal because Hamas is a designated terrorist organization. But Miriam, I heard you describing people just descriptively that also sound like they're OPT participants. Right. So they're graduated now. and they're in a work program that isn't statutory. It's been litigated in the past, never really concluded whether it's legal or not. And that's not with respect to the individuals in it. That's the program itself. And this was also one of those areas where in the first Trump term, there was not a great deal of aggressiveness. So that this has involved people in the OPT program doesn't surprise me either. I would just note that commenting, and Miriam has more factual information on this by far than I do, about people having minor infractions and a history of those. One of the things, set aside, moral or safety considerations of any kind of criminal or any violation of law. Speeding is not a criminal violation in most places, but it still puts you on the radar of authorities in a way that other people in the same status are not. And as a simple matter of efficiency and trying, once they've made a policy decision, which they clearly have, to at least remove some student visa holders or recent student visa holders like the OPT participants, then the even minor infractions put you on the radar. They identify where you are. They make you easier to find relative to alternatives. And as a simple matter of efficiency of pursuing a policy like this, it makes you much more likely to be subject to it, at least earlier on, because it's easier to do. And virtually all of these statuses are, well, anything can be litigated, and it all is, also include at the pleasure of the, nation of the United States. So ending these statuses is not, as a technical or legal matter, hard to do for the government.
Brian, this seems like a great place from talking about litigation for you to jump in. We know the administration is, for some of this, relying on a rarely used provision of the Immigration Nationality Act for some of the detentions and deportations. So if you could respond to Ken's framing of this as a legal matter from where you're sitting, please.
Yeah, I want to talk about that subset. And Ken referred to it as Hamas protests, but I think it's useful to look at the case of Rümeysa Öztürk, whom I represent. Ms. Öztürk was a PhD student at Tufts University, and the only thing she's accused to have done is to have written an op-ed in the Tufts student newspaper asking the university to take seriously some resolutions passed by the student government in relation to human rights violations in Gaza. And because she wrote that op-ed, masked, plainclothes ICE enforcement officers grabbed her off the street of Somerville, Massachusetts, threw her into a van. She thought she was being abducted and would likely be killed, and quickly transported her first out of Massachusetts, then out of Vermont. And by the next morning, she was in Louisiana, where she's currently being detained. And the Washington Post reported last night that the only evidence that the administration had was this op-ed that she had written. And according to the Washington Post reporting, there's no evidence whatsoever that she's in any way linked to Hamas or any other foreign designated terrorist organization. So what's really going on here, as I think her case demonstrates, and as the dozens of other cases that are currently being filed around the country demonstrate, is that the administration is going after anybody who speaks out in favor of Palestinian rights whatsoever. You have that in the Khalil case, you have that in the Badr Khan-Suri case out of Georgetown, you have that in numerous other cases, and I've yet to see an actual link between any of these individuals and a foreign designated terrorist organization. And that's why the administration is not relying on the provision of the Immigration Nationality Act that prohibits support for terrorist organizations. Instead, as you mentioned, it's relying on this foreign policy provision. This was a provision initially enacted around the Red Scare. It was designed to basically kick communists out of the country without any due process or respect for their First Amendment rights. It actually led to a Supreme Court ruling 80 years ago in a case called Bridges versus Wixon, where the court recognized that non-citizens residing in the United States have full First Amendment rights of speech and press. And as a result of that, they actually amended that provision of the Immigration Nationality Act to say that the government can't even exclude people simply because of their political beliefs, associations, or expression. unless the secretary points to a compelling foreign policy interest. And what the legislative history of that provision shows is that when there's a compelling foreign policy interest, what it really means is the former head of a enemy government. So, for example, the Shah of Iran, or someone whose presence in the United States would violate a treaty to which the United States is a party. That was what that provision of the Immigration Nationality Act was designed to address, not to address student protesters. But even putting that aside, courts have regularly held that non-citizens in the United States have First Amendment rights, and that although the government often does have very broad discretion in deciding, for example, whether to revoke a visa, it can't use that discretion to retaliate against someone for their protected speech. And that's what's at issue here.
I want to go to you, Congressman, in a second, but Ken, just really quick on one thing that Brian said. Do you disagree with his summation that non-citizens have these First Amendment rights? Because I know this has been a subject of disagreement.
Yeah, I would not characterize it as the same as U.S. citizens, no, but they do have, they do have a panoply of rights under the Constitution. And you go through the Constitution point by point. They vary somewhat in terms of the measured against U.S. citizens, the degree to which they hold similar rights.
Okay, this seems like this will be central, right, to some of this moves in the court. But Congressman, I know this Turkish student is not in your district; she is in your state. You're obviously in a state where higher ed is a huge employer, a huge factor in your state. But let's talk about Congress for a second. What role does Congress have, in your view, in this matter? What's being talked about in the Hill? I know there was a small number of members, yourself included, who signed a letter addressed to Kristi Noem, I think, about this. What role, if any, does Congress have at this juncture in this situation?
Well, Congress should be doing oversight of all of this. I think this is chilling, quite frankly. I mean, I sent another letter to Secretary of State Rubio and to Secretary of Homeland Security Kristi Noem today, because I've had 14 students in my own congressional district that have had their visas revoked without any indication as to why. The universities weren't notified in advance, and people are panicked. And look, I think this is very political. I think there is an attempt to go after people who are saying things or posting things that the administration doesn't agree with. And the idea that somehow anybody who advocates on behalf of Palestinian rights is somehow aligned with Hamas is ridiculous. I mean, what's happening in the Middle East is tragic. And what's happening to the Palestinians is tragic. That's not to diminish the concerns of Israelis and to take focus off the hostages. But I mean, I think anybody who cares about human rights, whether they're from this country or not, is concerned about what's happening to the Palestinians. But Congress is doing nothing, basically. The committees of jurisdiction are basically quiet. And I think part of that is out of deference to the president. And I wish there was, I wish they would demonstrate a little bit more independence. But this is something that deserves a thorough hearing. The oversight committees ought to be doing their job. And by the way, I've had students on some of the college campuses that I've visited, not only express concern about retaliation against students from other countries who are here by revoking their visas. They're worried about what could happen to them if they continue to voice their concerns on issues that they have deep feelings about. So I wish Congress was living up to its role in terms of checks and balances, but right now it is not.
Can you tell us candidly, outside of the committee rooms, you talk to your colleagues on both sides of the aisle, I assume. Is there conversation that you hear just informally of concern? And if so, is that limited to Democrats?
No, I mean, I have had candid conversations with Republicans who are concerned about the direction this administration is taking our country, not only on immigration, but in terms of what's happening in Ukraine. I can go right down the list of concerns, but I think there is a fear amongst Republicans that if they cross this president, they'll have a primary challenge. Elon Musk is the richest man in the world and dumped a lot of money into the president's campaign, dumping millions of dollars into a campaign to defeat a Republican incumbent in a primary is something that he would probably consider. So I think there's a lot of political fear. This is a moment that demands a little courage, quite frankly. And I think all of us need to be less worried about our reelection and more worried about doing what's right for this country. I'm afraid the damage that is happening right now may be irreversible. So this is a time to speak out and to be heard. And by the way, college presidents and university presidents ought to be screaming louder than they are. Some of them have signed an amicus brief, and I appreciate that. But there ought to be more outrage from the higher ups in our university and college communities. I understand nobody wants to be a target, but guess what? You already are a target. You already are a target.
And Brian, can you help us sort out a little bit? I know that and Brian and Miriam and Ken, you should jump in too if you want on this part. So there's an involvement of Homeland Security, and then there's the involvement of the State Department. And I think it's a little confusing. Do they overlap in terms of the jurisdiction over this and their actions? Can you just kind of lay that out for us and explain?
I'll turn it over to Ken in a second because I think he's probably more expert in this than I am. But with regards to making the foreign policy determination, that's a determination that can really only be made by the Secretary of State. The Department of Homeland Security is the federal agency that mostly carries out immigration enforcement and deportation measures.
So it's a bit of a domino, or it's a 1 and the 2, a 1-2 basically.
I think that's right.
Yeah, just to add on to Brian's comment, I agree with him on the foreign policy determination in this particular instance, utilizing this legal authority. But just for the students present, there is a lot of overlapping authority between the Secretary of Homeland Security, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General in areas related to immigration. The manpower used for enforcement, when that's the question, which is a lot of what we're talking about here, does typically come from the Department of Homeland Security. But you've already seen in the second Trump administration where they have utilized law enforcement officers from the Department of Justice, something that really we got in the first Trump administration, DHS, we got none of that support to pursuing any of our missions, really, other than, well, none of the immigration missions. So that's a change just in terms of how the enforcement operates. But in this space, you're talking about State Department legal authority, but more generally on immigration decisions, there is a lot of overlapping legal authority between the Attorney General, Secretaries of State, and Homeland Security.
Natalia, you're here because you are a fellow here. You remember the Russian opposition, and you've talked a lot in the recent weeks that you've been here that you see a lot of things going on in the United States that remind you of your time in Russia. Is there anything specific about the case with students that you would allude to or speak of?
Well, obviously, those are politically motivated actions. This is basically those in power saying you have a view of things that is different from ours, and we're going to do something about it. We're going to go after you. And going after international students is the first step. This is what everybody has to understand. This is where it begins, but not where it ends, most likely. Next step would be American students being called in if they voice a radical opinion on something, as far as, once again, those in charge of the country right now perceive it and see it. It doesn't end with this. This is why it's such a critical moment. It's so important to address it as much as possible in every shape and form, because this is what's been happening in Russia. Not so much for the international students, because Russia is not America, it doesn't have top universities like America does. In Russia, it was students in general who were expelled for having a certain point of view, writing certain things on social media, or attending a rally here or there. Expelled, and these days, this is what, again, it started with people just getting expelled. Today, they're in jail. Today, students who dare to speak out are jailed. And that's why most people don't speak out, obviously, out of fear.
Miriam, you've covered immigration for many, many years. How do you contextualize this moment vis-a-vis all of your coverage, but specifically around students?
Well, I think you have to take a step back and just consider the fact that we're living in an era of maximum enforcement. Trump entered office with a promise to carry out mass deportations. he's determined to fulfill that promise, even if it takes deporting students who bring so much to institutions like yours. And this increased enforcement against, immigrants of all kinds, including people here who have been in the country with green cards or legal permanent residency. And in terms of the universities, the students coupled with the funding cuts, it's just created this climate of fear and tension, right? I mean, and that's completely new.
So, Congressman, you're a member of the bipartisan task force for combating anti-Semitism, and we see that some of the financial cuts to universities and some of these deportations, right, and these legal actions, there's some overlapping themes around that. Do you see any connection, or how do you sort of separate out for yourself that goal and what's happening?
Look, anti-Semitism is a problem, not only here in the United States, but globally, and we all have to do more to combat it. But just because somebody disagrees with U.S. policy in the Middle East right now, or somebody objects to what Prime Minister Netanyahu is doing, doesn't mean they're anti-Semitic. Just because people believe that the Palestinians have rights, to call them anti-Semitic is ludicrous. We ought to be able to have an honest conversation on the Middle East and not have it go off in a direction, quite frankly, that is not justified. That's not to say that anti-Semitism isn't real. It is real in this country, and we have to do more to combat it. But to hide behind that as a justification to go after students who post anything that is critical of Netanyahu or that is pro-Palestinian, again, pro-Palestinian doesn't mean pro-Hamas, is really chilling to me. I mean, think of the tragedy that is unfolding in the Middle East right now. And rather than having conversations, or rather than engaging people into figuring out ways to resolve this, we are basically sending signals to people that if you talk about this stuff in a way that we don't like, there'll be a repercussion. I mean, this is the United States of America, right? People are supposed to be able to say what they want. People are supposed to have different opinions. And I feel that under this administration, that not only is that being discouraged, but you are actually being threatened for having differences of opinion.
Brian and Ken, I'm going to want you to respond both to that and to what Natalia said. But I know, Congressman, that your time is almost up, and I just wanted to give any students in the room any opportunities to ask a question of you before you depart. Go ahead in the front row, please.
Yeah, camera's this way. Can you see me? Oh, hello, Representative. I'm a third year here at the college, and I wanted to know your opinion on the impact of universities being the first, really, before this Trump administration to discipline students and I guess sort of harm their free speech rights. Here at this university, we evicted 2 students for protesting and engaging in pro-Palestinian protests. How has this affected the Trump administration's ability to now deport people? Do you see this as a sort of slippery slope? What do you think the university should be doing in response?
Yeah, so I don't know the individual circumstances of those students. If it's peaceful protest, the university should respect that. The U.S. was founded on the right to bitch. That's free speech, if we want, right? And people ought to be able to express themselves, especially on a college or university campus. I've heard all the explanations from some leaders in universities where they're afraid that their federal research dollars might be frozen, or this might be frozen, or they might get this. Look, this is a moment for courage in our country. And I really, I don't have to agree with everything that you say, or you don't have to agree with everything I say, but we ought to have the right to express ourselves. I'm against any kind of violent protest. I think everybody in this room is as well. But if you have the right to express yourself, and especially in the United States, and especially on a university or college campus. And so I've been critical of those colleges and universities that I think have gone beyond what is reasonable and what is right in terms of trying to discourage debate. And I get it. If you're on the board of trustees of a college, university, your job is to make no waves so that nobody pays attention to you and you don't become a target. But guess what, ladies and gentlemen, you're already targets. Every college and university in this country is a target. As I said, I mean, I have 14 students that I just found out about this week in my district from various colleges that have had their visas revoked. I'm still trying to figure out why. And it's going to continue unless there's a more concerted and forceful and loud effort to push back.
Any other students over here for the congressman?
Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Camila, and as you may know, obviously, there's a lot of disappointment and frustration with the Democratic Party right now. Do you see this sort of situation with colleges and universities in a moment for Democrats to step up in Congress? And how would you like to see that happen?
Well, first of all, if the Democratic Party were in Europe, would probably be 15 different parties. So let's just state that for the record. There's all kinds of opinions. But look, I think it's a good thing for us to be associated with free speech. I think it's a good thing for us to be for, a free exchange of ideas in academic settings. I think debate is a good thing. Quite frankly, I have strong disagreements with our policy right now in the Middle East. And I wish more people would raise their voices and express that opinion. I think some people don't because, they're afraid of what the implications might be or the pushback. But look, I do think that the Democratic Party, if we stand for anything, ought to stand not only for the Constitution, but we ought to stand out loud and foursquare for human rights. And when we start ignoring human rights, whether it's halfway around the world or halfway down the block, then we start losing our moral authority to claim a leadership mantle. And look, this is not a time to withdraw. This is not a time to be quiet. I really do think this is a time for us to express ourselves clearly and concisely. And we ought to be on the side of free speech and on the side of human rights.
Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for joining us today. I'm mindful of your time. We appreciate you joining. I'm going to turn to the other panelists, each one of you, before we get into some more of the nitty gritty, Brian, on the legal maneuvers that are to come. I wondered if I could get all three of you to respond to when Natalia said, obviously, Brian, you're looking at it through a legal lens of citizens' rights. Miriam, you've been all around the world and and you've covered immigration again in the United States for a long time. And Ken, you understand best on the Zoom the mindset of the administration. So Natalia has asserted that this is a foot in the door, if you will, that will eventually also be a legal maneuver, possibly targeted at U.S. citizens and American students. From the perspective in which I've just framed up, could you give a sense of whether you agree with that or what your observation is about that? Brian, starting with you.
I want to start by turning to something Ken said, which is, I'm sorry, turning to something Congressman McGovern said, which is that, people really disagree about what constitutes anti-Semitism, but we're certainly seeing from this administration that any expression regarding Israel and Palestine that deviates from the administration's preferred foreign policy line will be labeled as anti-Semitic. And it's for precisely that reason that the clearest command of the First Amendment is that the government does not have the power to determine what shall be orthodox in matters of politics. The government can't set a firm legal line on what is or isn't a protected opinion and what can be punished with deportation or being hauled into a prison thousands of miles away from your home. And so I think the line that's being tested here is whether that's really true, whether the government can actually say the expression of opinions that have foreign policy consequences or that the administration believes constitute support for terrorism in some way are some special exception to the First Amendment. And if you crack the door open to that, it's only a matter of time before those protections will be eroded for citizens as well.
Ken, do you agree with that?
No, I'm sure that's a shock to all, but the fact of the matter is this administration, and I think quite appropriately, is dealing with people who are not U.S. citizens as being in a different legal category, and that is entirely appropriate. It values U.S. citizenship as well. And whether you agree with their policies or not, it is interesting to hear so many people who are defending non-Americans' rights to speech. And I fully grant that there is a very legitimate First Amendment debate to be had here along the lines that Brian has made the case for and is making the case for on behalf of his client, Ms. Öztürk. But I reject the potential for the slippery slope here, and particularly from a lot of the people who are making these arguments in the United States. They were absolutely absent from years of censorship. It's really interesting to hear, you can't disagree with the government, or you have to be able to disagree with the government, unless it's about COVID, or it's about, and we just start filling in the blank, or elections, another area I work in, where censorship was very actively practiced by the US government without consequence in the last administration. That censorship structure has been dismantled by the Trump administration. The key legitimate exception, by legitimate I mean that it's, I don't think there's an argument that speech plays a role in the Trump administration's decision making for the immigrants or the visitors we're talking about here. So I'll acknowledge that on my side of the argument, but I would note that an awful lot of people who suddenly are very interested in the First Amendment, including, and I'm sorry the congressman had to leave, including the Democrat Party itself, were quite absent from that battlefield while actual censorship was taking place actively with administrative bodies set up in the US government to perform that function quite openly, frankly. And so, Russia lacks a fundamental rule of law at all. And I know there are a lot of people who say, oh, Trump got elected, so we don't have the rule of law anymore. I might suggest to you that you might check in on whether you're suffering from Trump derangement syndrome. In my office hours, I talked to one young lady who obviously was upset that Trump had won and is a dual citizen and thought about moving to the other country. And she's quite young by my standards. She's 20. And I said, I didn't enjoy what the Biden administration did, but I didn't contemplate moving. You do win some and you lose some. And I would say the American constitutional Republican model has been one of the most resilient in the history of the world. And we're going to battle our way through. Brian's case, frankly, is part of this evolution of finding the point of understanding of where is the balance for First Amendment rights for people who are not US citizens within the United States. I know he cited the Supreme Court case from a number of years back. And he knows this area of law right now better than I do. But I also know there are cases that don't speak quite so clearly to that. They speak more to exceptions along the lines of what Secretary Rubio has utilized his authority as the Secretary of State to do. So I think there's a lot here. I do not in this area buy the Russian slippery slope argument. Russia is a very sad country in the sense that there are no laws. As much as I may have complained about Joe Biden's abuses of power and other people complain about Donald Trump's, they don't do what Putin does. There's no prospect of them doing what Putin does. And we're blessed for that in this country.
I know, Brian, I can see you want to respond to that. I'm going to let Natalia respond to that, specifically the Russian piece. And I realize, Miriam, it's not fair to ask you about the slippery slope question. You cover immigration. So I will go to you in a second. And here's my question I'm going to ask you so you can contemplate it and go in your memories. I'm interested in hearing a little bit about the stories that you have picked up along the road from some of these students you've talked to personally, their families, people who are fearful. I just get to give us a little bit more texture of those who are actually being impacted. But Natalia, quickly, I'll let you go ahead and respond if you can.
If I can respond to Mr. Cuccinelli, Russia wasn't always what it is today, and Putin wasn't always what he is today. As a Russian, I can tell you that 25 years ago, Russia was a completely different country. There were human rights, and there was some form of rule of law. This was a gradual process that got us to the point when people are jailed for a post on Facebook. A guy got a couple of weeks ago 7 years in jail for a post on Facebook. This was not the case. Not only 25 years ago, even 10 years ago, it wasn't the case. Even 10 years ago, we were able to protest and go out on rallies without. Okay, first we were initially detained for 10 days. First, we weren't detained at all. Then we were detained for 10 days. Then they began locking people up. It's a gradual process. It happens from one point when it's like relative freedom, then first little things are thrown in, such as what we're seeing here at the moment, people thrown out of the country for okay, international students, fine, but nevertheless, for speaking out their mind. As I said in my first address, few words that I said in the beginning, it goes from here, and then it becomes more and more repressive. And then before you know it, you're in a dictatorship. So I'm sorry, but I don't accept the argument that we're not Russia. You're not Russia now. What if you're Russia in 20 years or 10 years time? This is what everybody has to keep in mind. It really starts with this. And it deteriorates. I was in the front line of our rallies with Alexei Navalny. We thought we're going to be fine. In fact, we thought we're going to be able to topple the regime. Navalny is dead. My friend is dead. And if I go back to Russia today, I'll be jailed within 24 hours, most likely. So I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Brian. I know I need want to go to you in this context and also to lay out some of the legal pathways before we go to questions. But Miriam, can you tell us a little bit about the interactions you've had, interviews you've had with students, to just give us a little texture for the students or their families or friends or students who are concerned? What are you hearing? What's the theme of it?
Right. I mean, honestly, it's been extremely difficult to reach the students because they're so afraid. So, I'm trying to get to folks who have left, who've chosen to leave. There are many who are finishing their PhD dissertations, back, say, in India, or they're completing their studies or coursework online. So what I'm hearing from the lawyers is that they just don't get it. They urinated in public. They were speeding, above the speed limit. They engaged in some disorderly conduct. How could this have happened? And on the first point, yes, obviously I don't really want to, offer my opinion, but I've been talking, interestingly, to immigrants who are now U.S. citizens from countries like South Sudan, Venezuela, and Russia. And they are just spontaneously telling me that they are very concerned that the U.S. is heading in that direction. So this is, not my assertion, but it's their concern.
Brian, you can jump in on any of these points. And I would also, I'm sure one thing that's of great interest to many students in this room, who we're going to turn over to Q&A pretty soon. You have at least one client. I don't know if you were attempting with case law with this, or what is the legal strategy for the ACLU and others defending those who are being asked to leave the country?
So I first just want to acknowledge that Ken's in a tough room, and I want to thank him for his willingness to participate in this civil debate, because that is how we're going to find our way out of the situation. I also want to acknowledge that it is true that both parties violate the First Amendment. In fact, just last term, we represented the National Rifle Association for the Supreme Court because the superintendent of financial services in New York was trying to get all the banks and insurance companies in the state to blacklist the NRA. And we won a 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court by Justice Sotomayor saying that that violates basic First Amendment freedoms. Now, this term, we see Trump trying to use the same kind of blacklist technique on law firms that represent his political opponents or causes that are adverse to the administration. So on some level, yes, there is a tale as old as time aspect to administrations violating the First Amendment. But I think this is an unprecedented moment in terms of the rounding up of dissidents. That's something that we really haven't seen in this country in 75 years at least. And in particular, there have been recent lower court decisions from the Second Circuit and the Ninth Circuit recognizing that retaliating against non-citizens for their protected speech by placing them into removal proceedings or by detaining them is unconstitutional under the First Amendment, even when the various federal agencies have significant discretion in determining how to carry out immigration enforcement policies. In terms of the legal strategy for how we're addressing this right now, these cases are being addressed through habeas corpus petitions. This is what's known as the Great Writ. It's one of the bedrocks of American rule of law, originally of British rule of law, which is that the courts will review the constitutional basis for someone's detention. So when you have these students or faculty members who are being ripped from their homes and placed into ICE detention facilities, we're able to go into court and file these petitions. And this is one of the things that makes America great, is that a neutral federal judge is going to review the constitutionality of the basis for that detention. And that's how these First Amendment claims are currently being adjudicated.
And Miriam, have you been able to talk, again, with any families or anyone who are entering the legal process on this? Are you getting that sense of the story?
I haven't, unfortunately. I mean, I've talked to lawyers who have filed individual lawsuits, but I've not talked to the families or the students. It's been incredibly challenging to report on this, you know, in terms of getting, you know, to people directly impacted.
And is that because people are more afraid? Because there have obviously always been legal and illegal immigrants who've been in the shadows in this country and are being concerned with any kind of exposure. Is it different with this particular cohort of students?
Well, I think it's because it's students, right? I mean, we haven't seen anything like this before. And, you know, it's right. It's those who are pro-Palestinian, who have engaged in, you know, demonstrations or protests. And it's people who, you know, committed some minor offense, you know, even 13 years ago in the case of, you know, one of these students who a lawyer described to me. So I think everybody's just, it's just all so opaque and scary to everybody that, yeah, it's this like scary new territory that we're trying to figure out.
And the opacity that she's describing, Ken, is that by design, or do you disagree that it's opaque? Anything, and also, did you want to respond to some of the comments that have been made in the last few minutes?
I don't know, of course, from any firsthand knowledge, but I would observe that it's harder for your potential legal opponents to prepare if you aren't announcing what you're doing. I mean, I'm just being Captain Obvious there. So that may well be part of the strategy. It may also be part of the strategy to be doing this at the same time as many other steps. One thing if I could look forward a little bit, not so much in the area we've been talking about, where it's really been focused on Middle Eastern students, but if the U.S.-China economic dispute roils forward, one of China's great vulnerabilities to the U.S. is how many hundreds of thousands of students they have in the United States. And those visas could be curtailed as a way of turning the screws on China for other negotiations. And it wouldn't surprise me to see that. That obviously wouldn't be related to anything specific to those individual students, but it is a potential point for that. I do want to go back to the Russia point. If you think of anything in the last few years that would point to shaking traditional foundations of American law, it was the determined political prosecutions of Donald Trump, including in New York, where you had Alvin Bragg run for office, and Letitia James run for office on the idea, I'll sue him for something. And Alvin Bragg made up new criminal charges that had never been applied to anyone else before to prosecute Trump. And, you know, that was a weaponization directly aimed at putting him in jail, and keeping him from the presidency. I can tell you, as a person who helped start a DeSantis for President super PAC, that those efforts backfired within the GOP. They made Donald Trump bulletproof in the nomination process. I mean, from March of 2023, I think it was, when Alvin Bragg began this formally, Donald Trump was essentially unbeatable in the nomination. We didn't know it then, but that's the way it turned out. So
Let's take this
I think
back to
that's actually the
30,000.
closest thing to the kind of abuse that we saw unfold eventually in Russia.
Well, can we just bring this back to this immigration story again? If we could, have you been able to talk, Brian, to your client? It seems like one of the things that's been going on is when people are detained, they've it's been tough for their lawyers to even get to them. What's going on there?
It is tough, especially when they're detained thousands of miles away. Fortunately, we are in touch with our clients. I also represent Mr. Khalil in his habeas corpus proceeding. There are remote communication facilities set up at these detention facilities where we can have conversations with our clients. But it's absolutely much more difficult to prepare a legal case when your clients ripped from their home and their family and the places where most of their lawyers are. And so one of the aspects of relief that we're seeking from the federal courts in these cases is to have our clients returned to the jurisdictions where they were when their habeas corpus petitions were filed. So that would be New Jersey and Vermont. I do think there's been a coordinated strategy on the administration's part to very quickly snatch these people, put them in vans, drive them over state lines, and get them on a plane as soon as possible so they're no longer within the jurisdiction at the time the habeas corpus petition is filed. And what that means is that the administration gets to control ultimately where this case happens and how it plays out, but it's very, very unusual.
And Miriam and Brian, both, is that in your time in this field, is that unprecedented or what you've just described?
I think the way they're doing it here is unprecedented. And I'll point, for example, to Ms. Öztürk's case where I believe the State Department memo that was reported in the Post said that her visa revocation was a silent revocation. Normally, when the Department of State revokes someone's visa, they give them notice about it, and then they say, okay, you have this many days to leave the country. And in Ms. Öztürk's case, they didn't do that. She had no idea that her visa had been revoked until those masked, plainclothes ICE agents picked her up off the streets of Somerville. So that is not, I believe, a normal part of the immigration process.
Do you agree with that, Miriam, in your reporting?
Yes, I agree 100%. I mean, but then, and again, it's just so unprecedented. I mean, I'm used to reporting on mainly in the scenario of immigration detention, undocumented immigrants who, are picked up like at 4 or 5 in the morning when they're, getting ready to go to work. I've been with like ICE agents who've been kind of staking out their homes, waiting for them to emerge and, grab them. And there is always been this kind of, chess playing situation, and Mr. Cuccinelli can speak to that, where people are moved to detention facilities far from home if that's where there's a bed space. So, maybe, forever I've known, immigrants who were, apprehended in, Oklahoma, who ended up in, in Texas or in Louisiana, where, there are many, many immigration detention centers. So there tends to be space. I've written about Russians who were detained in California and who were flown to, Louisiana and Mississippi. So that kind of thing has always happened. I've not really thought about it in the context of like what Brian is describing, which makes so much sense. But I think it's also, in what he's describing, it's so extraordinary, right? I mean, the way that, the government has a strategy with the students.
Okay, I want to be able to, we have about 10 minutes or so left. I want to be able to open it up for questions for our panelists from students over here. Camera's this way, by the way, guys. Yep.
Hi, my name is Yasmin. I'm a third-year student, and I have a legal question for Brian. I wanted to ask about what practical actions the presidents or boards at these higher education institutions can do. What kind of recourse can they take in terms of like coalition building? What kind of conversations can their lawyers be having right now to prepare? Because as our representative had said, like this is the situation going on right now, but we can totally expect more universities to be targeted.
I think one very concrete action universities can take is they're not obligated to allow ICE agents onto their campuses, which are private property, without a judicial warrant. And so requiring government officers, whenever they want to search a student's room or arrest a student on campus property, to provide such a warrant before they allow the students onto campus property, I think is one very concrete action the institutions can take. Another concrete action, as Congressman McGovern pointed out earlier, is being more vocal in these cases, whether it's through the filing of amicus briefs or issuing of statements or sign-on letters. Institutions have a lot of political power within our system. And when they raise their voices and make it clear that they will not tolerate these very severe incursions into academic freedom that will inspire others to also stand up for these people's First Amendment rights.
Anything, any students over here? Any students? Go ahead.
Hi, Brian. My name is Chris. I'm a 30 here. I'm an organizer at U Chicago, and I'm putting on a Know Your Rights panel on Thursday. I wanted to know from your opinion as an ACLU lawyer representing someone who has been a victim of these deportations and proceedings, what should I be telling them that is new?
I actually think the best thing you can do is you can go to the ACLU of Illinois should have Know Your Rights materials. There are also some reports recently about Secretary Homeland targeting people for publishing Know Your Rights trainings, suggesting that somehow just informing people of their rights is itself aiding and abetting violations of federal law. We have a separate training called Know Your Rights on Know Your Rights, which explains that, but there's absolutely a First Amendment right to advise the public on their constitutional rights, and you should rest confident in those protections.
Natalia, did you want to ask a question of Ken?
Well, I wanted to respond very, very
Oh,
quickly. I'm so sorry. Mr. Cuccinelli, I understand completely why you're repeating the narrative of Mr. Trump. And he did himself, prior to the elections, maybe 18 months ago or so, compared himself to Alexei Navalny. And we were floored by that, because right after he voiced that, his entourage walked over to his private jet, boarded it, and flew to Mar-a-Lago somewhere. This was at the time when Alexei Navalny was starved to death and eventually a few months later killed, poisoned in jail, while Donald Trump was elected president. So I think there is no comparison. And I hope this is going to be a takeaway from my presence here today. Thank you.
And yet it is the closest and best example of the abuse of government power in recent American history. And so I appreciate you making my case, though I will make the point, I don't carry anybody's narratives. I didn't start the Trump for president super PAC. I started the DeSantis for president super PAC. So I'm an idealistic lawyer who loves the law and believes in it. I may have different views than other people on here, but I speak for myself, and I don't take that kind of crap from anybody. Sorry.
We'll definitely put the DeSantis PAC in your bio, your official IOP.
That's okay.
Any other students in the room that have questions? Go ahead back there, please.
Fear-based tactics that have been used in Russia for years and years, and what's been happening in politics here over the past few years.
Well, I can tell you what I've observed recently. Even students are afraid to speak around their phones. They're like thinking that maybe because they've heard a lot about how phones are used as a listening devices potentially, and I'm not saying that's the case, obviously, but that fear speaks for itself. I mean, that's what worries me a lot at the moment. American students, I'm not even talking about international students, I'm talking about American students who are becoming more and more concerned that the government will come after them. That's just my observation. And yeah, I mean, we've lived through horrible times, starting with, them kind of letting us be and ending where we're at today, where all of us, the opposition is either dead or imprisoned, or like myself, I'm pronounced enemy of the state in Russia. And if I cross the border, as I already mentioned, I'll be in jail like practically right away. It's just a fact. It's not an exaggeration. But it's, it doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. Alexei Navalny 10, 12 years ago actually thought he could be elected president of Russia. Today he's dead. He's been dead for over a year. And the techniques they use, it's intimidation, it's persecution. I had 2 criminal cases against me. I almost ended up in jail. House raids, constant surveillance. My phone was listened to 24/7. I would make an appointment to meet somebody in 2 hours. Like we discuss and decide on the location today, like right now, and 2 hours they're there. FSB's there, filming me, then eventually detaining me. All of that is what we went through, experience. When I went back to Russia, I actually lived outside of Russia. prior to 2012, when I decided to go back because it was obvious Putin is going to be a huge danger, not just to Russia, but globally. It didn't happen right the first day, but it happened pretty, you know, the persecution, the going after us started happening pretty soon after that. And we had a lot of following. We had a lot of people attending rallies. As soon as arrests started to happen, people started to decide we better stay away. This is too dangerous for me and my family. And at the end of the day, it was just us, a small group of people, and the regime was going after us in the way, as Donald Trump would say, like the world has never seen before. So it's a curve, it's a process, and it's a very scary one. And I hope this wonderful country that I love very, very much will not end up in the same situation as Russia did.
I think we have room for one more question. Oh, over here, please.
Hi, thank you. This is for Mr. Cuccinelli. My name is Izzy. I'm a second year. You talked a little bit earlier about the different actors that go into these like detentions. Could you just talk briefly about like the steps of how people decide which students should be detained, how they're kind of surveilling might not be the right word, but how they're looking through social media and finding these different people and then making decisions, since obviously it's not just random. But I'd love to hear a bit about that. Thank you.
So I don't know the process they're using. They have publicly said that they have utilized or reviewed social media posts. So that's been in the news. But that just tells me a tool they're using, not so much how they're prioritizing or you know, if you put the whole pool of folks they have an interest in revoking visas for or legal status. I don't know what the tier 1, 2, and 3 is. I think we were talking a little bit about that here earlier, is that that's not entirely clear yet. And they have not made any particular announcement to explain that. And there can be reasons they haven't done that because they view this as a adversarial environment, and it is an adversarial environment. And they are seeking to utilize keeping their own plans to themselves as an element of advantage in executing those plans. And that's just speaking statistically, that's accurate. If they share those plans, then potential adversaries can take legal steps in advance of them executing on plans, and it's harder for them to accomplish them. So I don't know what the priorities are right now. I mean, the president ran on addressing the circumstances, particularly involving international students on campuses, most particularly among those protecting Jewish students. And we've talked today, and you know, the Öztürk case, for example, I'm not aware of any facts other than speech there. So that's in one category. But a lot of these universities, you look at Columbia as sort of the case example here. Jewish students were assaulted, threatened, intimidated, and the administrations weren't doing anything. And that was going on at universities all over the country to differing degrees. I was recently appointed to the Board of Visitors, which is sort of the board of directors of a public Virginia university, the University of Virginia. And the first people I was hearing from were the parents of Jewish students about how they're still afraid based on some of the behavior on campus and how that is or is not being addressed. So, you know, we've talked about the speech part, but let's not forget, there were thousands and thousands of Jewish students all over the country who were being threatened and intimidated quite intentionally by certain aspects of this movement that arose after October 7th, 2023. So
Brian, I'm sorry, we're just about to be done, sir. And sorry to interrupt you, Ken, but we're almost done. But Brian, do you just to the student's question,
Yeah.
Just, do you have any of the specifics on, because there has been some reports about social media and things like that. Do you have any more of the specifics you could add to that, just to answer
I
the question
absolutely
real
do have a
quickly?
theory as to how the administration is prioritizing its actions in this area, and that it's relying essentially on lists compiled by organizations like Canary Mission or Batar. For example, in Ms. Öztürk's case, about a week before she was picked up, all of a sudden she appeared on a Canary Mission list accusing her of anti-Semitism for her op-ed. And then lo and behold, the ICE agents are picking her up off the streets of Somerville shortly thereafter. Similarly, Mr. Khalil was identified, I believe, by both Canary Mission and Batar shortly before he was arrested. And so one of the themes we're seeing is these arrests are playing out around the country is these people are showing up on these Canary Mission and Batar and other lists of people who are accused of anti-Semitism by these private organizations. And what that really reminds me of is The Crucible, which of course is Miller's famous play about the Salem witch trials, which is really an allegory for America under McCarthyism, where you have private groups denouncing their fellow community members for holding, unwarranted opinions. And then the government sweeping in without any real semblance of due process, wielding stuff like guilt by association to lock these people up. And I think that's a very chilling place for the country to end up in.
Well, thank you so much, Brian, Miriam, and Ken, and Natalia. You're all incredibly busy people involved in these cases and other issues. So we appreciate both your willingness to come and speak with our students today, and also, Brian, as you alluded to, we do maintain this as a free speech space, a space for civil discourse, and you've all demonstrated that so beautifully today. So thank you again for upholding that and upholding our values. And thank you again so much. And we hope to see you in this room in person or on Zoom again.